Most people don't hustle because they love it. They hustle because they believe it's the price of success. And for a long time, I believed that too. And to be clear, hustling delivered real results for me. I got promotions, more money, recognition, and influence. But here's what I didn't understand at the time. When hustle becomes the default way of operating, it's usually a sign that we're already in the funk. Today, I want to talk about what it looks like to build your life and career without living in the constant hustle. Welcome to the WTF Podcast, friends. My name is Molly Smith, and I'm on a mission to equip 1 million people with the tools to recognize when they're in the funk, but more importantly, how to pivot out of it. By tuning in today, you've joined me on this mission, and I am so grateful that you are here. Friends, this is where this conversation gets really interesting, because while hustle does work, there's a part of the story that rarely gets talked about, and that's that hustle comes with a cost. And in my experience, that cost doesn't show up right away. It shows up later. In those quiet moments after you've hit the goal, when there's an additional comma in that bank account balance, when you have acquired all of those followers and subscribers, and yet something on the inside still feels disconnected, unfulfilled, and strangely unhappy. That's not a problem to fix. That's information worth paying attention to. So the question I want to sit with today isn't whether or not hustle works, but whether it's the only way. And to answer that honestly, we need to get really clear on exactly what we're talking about, okay? So here's how I defined hustle. Hustle is taking action from the belief that if you just work harder and do more, the results will come, no matter how it feels and no matter what it costs. Hustle is rooted in scarcity. It's chasing and striving. It's action driven by fear of falling behind, fear of failure, fear of not being enough, or fear of losing relevance or worth. And I want to be clear about this part. The effort behind hustle, the time, the discipline, and the consistency is not what I'm questioning. What I'm examining here is the internal motivation behind hustle. It's the belief system that it's often built on. So let's talk about the opposite of hustle, what I call aligned action. Aligned action is intentional effort rooted in emotional sovereignty. It's action taken from self-trust rather than fear, from agency rather than survival, from groundedness rather than urgency. Aligned action still requires discipline, it still requires consistency, and it still requires showing up and doing the work. But the internal state behind that work is completely different. Same effort on the outside, very different experience on the inside. What separates hustle from aligned action isn't the work, it's the internal dialogue behind it. Hustle sounds like proving and performing and pushing, trying to stay ahead of the fear that something could fall apart if you slow down. Aligned action feels different on the inside. It comes from feeling supported and present, safe enough to think clearly, and sustainable in a way that doesn't keep you living on the edge. Same effort, completely different experience. Here's what I understand now that I couldn't see back then. Hustle lives in emotional chaos. When your action is driven by lack, your nervous system never feels safe because there's always an underlying message that's running in the background. This could fall apart. I could lose ground. I can't slow down yet. There's always more to do. Another bar to clear, another version of yourself to prove, another reason why you're still not quite there yet. You're constantly scanning for what's missing, what could fall apart, what needs fixing. And that internal environment creates emotional chaos, even when things look successful on the outside. You can be winning personally and professionally and still feel anxious, disconnected, and unsettled internally. I know this because I lived it. And because I didn't have the language or the tools to name and process what I was feeling, I coped the only way I knew how. I numbed what I was feeling. I pushed even harder and kept looking outside myself for validation and worth. That's what hustle culture teaches us to do. Now, listen, hustle isn't really the problem, it's just the symptom. Hustle is what manifests when we don't have another way to respond to what's happening internally. Now, for years, I hustled my way up the corporate ladder. And if I'm honest, the motivation behind that hustle wasn't just ambition, it was validation, worthiness, the promise of financial security, influence, and gravitas. I believed that if I could just get to the executive level, I would feel different, more confident, more settled, like I could finally exhale that I had arrived. And when I stepped into that role, I expected that to happen. It was very early in the pandemic, so right out of the gate, everything felt different than I expected. The role wasn't exactly what I imagined, but I loved the company, I loved the people, I loved the mission. And at first, the work largely fit with how I was wired. It wasn't until a couple of years in that things began to shift. The responsibilities started moving further and further away from my actual strengths. Not all at once, but slowly. But that's when the hustle went into overdrive for me. Because instead of pausing to ask whether or not the role still fit, I worked harder. I tried to close the gap. I told myself I just needed to figure it out. That's where the proving and the pushing and the performing came in. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared so much and I didn't know another way to respond. I tried hard. I worked my tail off trying to figure it out, trying to close the gap, trying to become whoever I thought I needed to be to make it work. But the harder I pushed, the more misaligned I felt. And that's when my inner dialogue really started to unravel. I wasn't enough. I wasn't smart enough. I wasn't experienced enough. Everyone else seemed to know something I didn't. So I compared. I second guessed myself. And over time, I felt very alone inside. There was a lot riding on that role. And without realizing it, my sense of self worth became tied to how I was performing at work. So, what I was experiencing wasn't just stress, it was a full on identity crisis. Day to day, it felt like holding everything together by sheer force. In some days, that looked like brute force hustle, rolling up my sleeves, pushing through, trying to manufacture momentum in the right direction. Other days, it looked like exhaustion, counting down the minutes until 5 o'clock so I could just turn the volume down on my own thoughts with 1 or 3 glasses of wine. Self care was completely gone in that season. By the end of the day, I was so spent, disconnected, and honestly, I barely recognized myself. From the outside, everything looked great, but on the inside, I was gripping tightly to something that no longer fit. And as I look back on it now, I can see exactly what was driving my behavior. I was proving, trying to show that I belonged. I was performing, managing perception, and holding it together. And I was pushing, ignoring my intuition, overriding my needs, and staying in motion so I wouldn't have to stop and really feel what was off. That was hustle for me. That's not ambition. That's not discipline, but proving, performing, and pushing as a way to keep going without pausing long enough to ask whether the path I was on still fit. Now, divine timing brought clarity for me when I realized I couldn't keep going down this path. This clarity showed up in a series of divinely appointed conversations that gently but firmly held up a mirror. I decided to stop drinking. I had a radically honest conversation with my boss. And for the first time, instead of asking, "How do I prove myself?" I asked a different question. What actually aligned with who I am and how I'm wired? And that question changed everything because it gave me permission to imagine what it might feel like to operate from a place that was actually energizing, to consider a path that I didn't have to abandon myself or hustle my way into feeling like I was enough. Now, that shift didn't happen overnight, but in the months that followed those conversations, something important changed. My boss and I created a role that was fully aligned to my skill set, one that centered on how I could add the most value inside the company. And that mattered more than I realized at the time, because months into that newly created role, my energy started to align. My capacity began to expand. Not because I was doing more, but because I was no longer hustling against myself. I wasn't spending days proving, performing, or pushing. I was operating in alignment with how I'm actually wired. And as a result, I became available mentally and emotionally for opportunities I never dreamed possible. Opportunities I simply could not have accessed when my energy was tied up in fear, self-doubt, and survival mode. The actions I took began to feel different. They felt easier, like I was moving with the current instead of swimming against it. I wasn't forcing momentum, I was working in concert with it. And that was the beginning of a completely different way of operating, because I was finally choosing from alignment instead of fear. This is what I mean by aligned action. Aligned action isn't passive, it's not slow, it's not lazy, and it's definitely not playing small. Aligned action comes from emotional sovereignty. When you're acting from emotional sovereignty, your nervous system isn't hijacked by urgency or fear. You're regulated enough to access clarity. You're aware of what you can control and what you can't. And you stop wasting energy trying to manage outcomes that aren't yours. And you take radical responsibility for the choices that are yours. And from that grounded, self-trusting place, action becomes congruent because it matches who you are, what you value, and what you're actually available for. It's no longer driven by proving, panic, or survival. It's driven by clarity, intention, and alignment. And when action comes from emotional sovereignty, the result is a positive return on energy. This is a concept that I learned from my dear friend, Cindy Whitteman, and it's become one of the clearest ways I evaluate whether or not my action is truly aligned or coming from hustle. Because hustle asks one primary question: what will this get me? Aligned action asks a better question: what is this going to cost me, and what is it going to give back to me? Not just financially, energetically, relationally, physically, and emotionally. When you are operating from emotional sovereignty, you're no longer burning energy to feel safe. You are investing energy from safety. Now, once you understand the difference, the contrast becomes impossible to unsee. Hustle is action taken to outrun discomfort. Aligned action is action taken from self-trust. Hustle is driven by lack. Aligned action is driven by clarity and integrity. Hustle keeps you productive inside emotional chaos. Aligned action emerges when emotional sovereignty is in place. Same discipline, same consistency, different fuel, very different experience. If you're listening to this and thinking, I've done it the hustle way and I'm tired, this isn't a call to do less. It's a call to get honest about what's driving your action. Not what you're doing, but why you're doing it. Because effort isn't the issue here. Discipline isn't the issue. Even ambition is not the issue. I'm not here to argue whether hustle works. It does. I'm proof of it. What I questioned in the very beginning of this episode is whether it's the only way. And from where I sit now, the answer is no. Hustle can produce results, but aligned action produces sustainability, self-trust, and a positive return on energy. And every day of the week and twice on Sunday, I will stand against hustling. It's just not worth the cost. If you know somebody who's been living in the hustle and quietly paying the cost, please share this episode with them. There is another way. And please subscribe to this podcast on whichever platform you are listening so you don't miss what's coming up next. These are important conversations to be having, and we're going to have them here on the WTF podcast. See you next time, everyone.